We explore very fundamental issues of research in AI and machine learning, but also these cutting edge transformational technologies. How do they help in engineering disciplines that you normally do not associate with IT? We look at a lot in the manufacturing sector, we look at civil engineering, we look at chemical engineering, we have a separate sub-center on biological systems engineering. We are using a lot of AI techniques in order to make much more fine-grained judgments about congestion in traffic patterns and being able to do real-time rerouting of traffic. In fact, we are working with the 108 ambulance service in Chennai to be able to, dynamically help them reallocate resources in a much more meaningful way, so that response time is cut down drastically. This is a unique center in that it is an interdisciplinary center studying AI. We have faculty members from 8 different departments and about 80 plus researchers at all levels, starting from postdoctoral students to research associates. This is not something that anybody who is looking for immediate commercial gains is going to fund. Not only do we look at fundamental research that increases India's visibility in the research community globally, we are also looking at enriching the whole ecosystem around us, so that just not the IITs become better at doing AI and cutting edge technology, but the entire the region around us and the entire country will get uplifted.
So good afternoon, everyone. And I welcome you to the IPC DSAI's International Summit on Data Science and AI. And so let me start off the proceedings by giving you a very short introduction to the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and AI. You already saw a little bit of it play now, and this is, if you will, a little more updated presentation on that. And then I'll set the context for this summit. Right. So the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and AI was founded in 2017 with funding from Robert Bosch. And as you heard in the video, it's a very interdisciplinary center. And in fact, right now it has grown to have representation from 10 different departments with 34 faculty members and more than 100 researchers who are part of the center. And so the vision of the center is to achieve a global prominence in AI and data science research with significant societal impact by primarily carrying out foundational research and creating top quality. The fundamental areas in which we conduct research or span the spectrum of AI and data science, going from deep learning, looking at network analytics, and learning with really hard data, with limited and partial data, causal modeling, reinforcement learning, and so on and so forth. Right? And we also carry out applied research, primarily insofar as it impinges on our fundamental research and also on looking at social good. And so applied research is primarily in 4 verticals: manufacturing analytics, financial analytics, smart cities, systems biology, and healthcare. And we also have several quality education programs, and we also work on various projects of social impact. Right? So you will see what I mean by this in the next couple of slides. And we collaborate extensively, both with industry as well as government bodies. And there are several NGOs that you would see here on the slide. And each one of these tiles that you see here represents at least one project that is being carried out by the center, if not multiple of these. And some of these are very strong social relevance. In fact, we work with the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. We work with the 108 ambulance, which you already heard mentioned. We are also a data science partner for the Genome India initiative. And we work with Google AI and Arman, which is an NGO. And you'll hear about this project from Professor Milind Tambe on Saturday when he talks about AI for social good. And we also work with, looking at preterm births with the THSTI. And again, you'll hear about a little bit more about this project tomorrow from Professor Himanshu Sinha. And so we also do a lot of work in terms of responding to COVID-19. There is a student presentation on some of this work on Saturday. We could also look at our webpage to see what we do exactly with COVID-19 work. And apart from that, we are carrying out a lot of different education programs. So we run the 5-year dual degree program in data science and IIT Madras. which is a program where the students get a bachelor's in any engineering discipline that we offer, and plus a master's in data science when they graduate at the end of 5 years. And we run an online, offline, a blended model certificate in technology and management jointly with IIM Bangalore. And we run many summer, winter schools and training programs and workshops and summits and conferences like this. And we also do an annual industry conclave where we get together practitioners from the industry as well as thought leaders in AI to have a very vibrant set of sessions. So apart from this, we offer a lot of other opportunities. We have postdoctoral fellowship, post-baccalaureate fellowships right after you finish your BTech. We have research travel fellowships, associate research program. There are many ways in which you can engage with the center, and I encourage you to please come visit our website to find out more about these programs. And we are also on social media. So we could search for RBC DSAI on your favorite social media platform, and you should find us. So that's about the center itself. And now moving on to the summit. So we are the first time we are doing this kind of a virtual online summit. We are calling this the RBC DSAI's International Summit on Data Science and AI. And as you have seen already, I mean, I'm sure most of you here or have looked at it in detail and are excited about being here. It's a 3-day program. And on day 1, we have the foundations of data science and AI, and we have a lot of exciting speakers lined up for you today. And you can see that it's a mix of people from here and outside India, and as well as people from ITM. And then on day 2, we have data science for healthcare. And again, there's a good mix of speakers from within India, outside India, and ITM. And on day 3, we look at data science and AI applications, and you'll see the same theme continuing here as well. So this is a truly international summit that we have put together. And I know that there are several participants out there who are not from India who are listening to us today. And the number of registrations we have received exceeded 12,000. And that's something that was beyond our initial estimate, way beyond what we thought we will be reaching. And I'm grateful to all of you who have signed up today and are watching this program. And of course, I really have to acknowledge the people who have responsible for putting this together. So the Foundations of Data Science and AI track chair is Professor Arun Rajkumar. And the data science for healthcare track chair was Professor Sagatika Sahu. And the data science and AI applications track chairs were Professor Nandan Sudarshanam and Geeta Krishnan Ramadrai. And apart from that, we had the local logistics and support chair, Mr. Sridhar, who is the COO of the Robert Bosch Center, as well as Dr. Philji Philip, who helped us organize the student presentations that you will be seeing throughout the summit. And apart from this, I'd really like to thank a lot of staff and student volunteers who really put in a lot of effort over the last few days to make sure that the event is up and running smoothly. Right. So the way the summit is going to be is that there'll be a lot of talks, which you've already seen on the schedule. But apart from this, there'll also be several student presentations. This will be pre-recorded videos of students talking about the various projects that they are involved in. And you could also visit the summit's homepage to get a more detailed view of these student presentations, where you get a full posters, the papers that they have worked on, and a whole bunch of other details. And the full program, the detailed the agenda for the summit is also available on the web page. Right. And again, of course, you can find some of these details on social media as well. Right. And at this point, I'll stop. And if there are any questions, let me look at those. Okay. Of course, I didn't really expect any questions on this already, but I just checking for completeness sake. And if there is nothing more, then I'll pause for a while before calling on the next speaker to start their presentations. Right. So maybe we can, because the scheduled start for the presentation is 2:30, and we stopped a few minutes early. And so I can, I'll pause for a bit and call the next speaker on stage, which is basically me. So.
Maybe Ravi, Arun here, so maybe we can pause for a couple of minutes and we can.
Wow. Okay, huge number of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm just looking at those. Okay, so I'm not a computer scientist. Please hope I can benefit appropriately. So most of the talks on day 2 and day 3 you would see are more on the application side of things. So even if you're not a computer scientist, you should be able to appreciate how AI and data science can help in various disciplines, right? And some of the talks on day 1 might be a little hard for people who are from a non-CS background to grasp, but at least in my case, I've tried to keep it as accessible as possible. I promise my talk will have no equations on them, but some of so this is essentially fundamentals of AI in data science. So it might be a little hard for people to follow, but days 2 and 3 are more on the application side of things. In fact, many of the speakers you would see in this in the day 2 and 3 are not actually computer scientists even. So it should be able to follow mostly. And there are a lot of, we are right now in shutdown, right? So any kind of fellowship that we offer now has to be a work from home fellowship. And so we will abide by all the lockdown rules of the government, and until the government tells us that we can open the institute, any kind of fellowships that we are offering would be work from home, right? And so there's one person who has complained that they're not able to hear. Are you able to hear me now? And yeah, so we can't, I apologize that we can't allow you to visit the center because right now we are in a shutdown. But there would be, once everything goes back to normal, there would be periodic open houses that we conduct, that we'll advertise about, and when people can come and actually visit the center. Right? And working professionals, it's not possible for you to take up any kind of projects or anything from the center unless you are enrolled in some kind of a part-time degree program at IIT Madras. Right. Please look at our webpage for actual details about qualifications and age limits, etc., for the various fellowships. Yeah, so we will be providing recorded videos, provided the speakers have no objections to it. But we will not be giving out any other materials, right? So when you registered, you would have seen a thing that where you accepted the fact that we will not be giving you materials out. And so that's basically it, right? And so I think we can stop here. I think we can stop here and then go on to the next presentations, right?
Yeah, so Ravi, maybe I'll quickly introduce the next presenter.
Do you have to? Okay, fine.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the summit. My name is Arun Rajkumar. So I'll be the host for day 1 of this summit, which focuses on the foundations of data science and AI. So I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Professor Balaraman Ravindran. Professor Ravindran is a Mindtree faculty fellow and a professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Madras. So his research areas are in machine learning and specifically in reinforcement learning. So his research interests also are in the areas of data mining, social network analysis as well. And as you have just heard, he heads the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and AI at IIT Madras. And we are extremely happy to start this summit with his talk on scaling up reinforcement learning. So yeah, so Ravi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Arun. And hello again, folks. And so today I'm going to talk about towards scaling up reinforcement learning. And so I'm aware that we have a fairly large and very general audience. And so I'm going to try and keep the talk at a fairly general level. Hope that people can follow. Right. Just one second, let me hide the control. So, some of you might be familiar with the term machine learning or deep networks or some of the buzzwords that are out there, right? So whenever I say that I'm teaching a machine to learn, right? So more often than not, what I'm doing is providing the machine with a lot of examples like this, right? So I'll give you a lot of pictures. and then tell you that everything in this picture is an airplane, or give you a lot of pictures like this, and then tell you everything in this picture is an automobile. And then giving these kinds of examples, and I expect the machine, the program, whatever, the software, to come up with a rule or a structure that allows me to assign a label to a previously unseen image. Right? So if I give you a new image, I should be able to tell whether it's a deer or a dog or a frog, whatever it is. Right? And so people just have come up with many techniques for doing it. Another way of thinking about it is, let's say I'm trying to learn to play. This kind of machine learning is called supervised learning. So let's say I'm learning to play this game of tic-tac-toe. So the way the examples here would look like is that I'll give you a set of positions like this. Okay, if this is the position that you find yourself in, this is the move that you have to make. Right? You can see that, right? If this is the position you find yourself in, and this is the move that you have to make, and then I'll give you many such examples, and based on that, you should learn a policy that will allow you to play the game regardless of what move you see. I'm sorry, regardless of what position that you see. Correct? So let me start with my favorite question. So all of these models of learning is fine because learning from data, but how did you learn to cycle? Right? So if I show you like 1,000 hours of videos of somebody cycling, can you then give you a cycle? Will you be able to get on that and cycle? No, really. Right? I mean, very unlikely that you will be able to cycle. So you have to try getting on the cycle, try it a few times, fall down, get hurt, or get shouted at by somebody, or if you're a kid and you're riding well, somebody will clap and say, hey, great job, right? So this is the kind of feedback that you get, right? So you have learning through trial and error, right? So if you think of what I said in the beginning about playing tic-tac-toe or about classifying images or labeling images, what you got were instructions. You were told before you started learning that this is what I expect you to do. You were given some kind of an instruction. Right? What you do in reinforcement learning is you first do something. You get on the cycle, you try something, right? And then you get evaluation for what you tried. Or did I fall down, or did somebody clap? So you get that kind of an evaluation. You were never told what is the right thing to do. You try something, and then you get evaluated. So this is the crux of what reinforcement learning is. Right? So I don't want to get too technical about it. I mean, we have actually Dr. Chandrasekhar, who will be talking later today, is going to give you a slightly more technical grounding on what reinforcement learning is. So I'll try to keep it at a more intuitive level. Right. In fact, it's not just cycling. If you think of how humans learn, whether how we learn to walk or how we learn to talk, etc., a lot of it is this kind of trial and error learning. Right. So if a baby, the baby will be making all kinds of random noises, and suddenly some adults will go crazy. Oh, he said mama. Everybody come look. Our baby said mama, amma, or something. Right. So they get crazy, and the baby says, oh wow, okay, that seems to be something nice. So let me try it again. So that's how babies learn to talk, by this kind of babbling and trial and error and so on and so forth. So it's a very fundamental learning paradigm. And so people have been trying to, model this, give it a mathematical framework. And that's essentially what reinforcement learning is all about. Right. And so to give you a contrast to how we looked at tic-tac-toe earlier, so the supervised learning way of playing tic-tac-toe, I give you board positions and I give you what is the right move to make. The reinforcement learning way of playing tic-tac-toe, I just tell you, hey, play the game. Right? I'll tell you if you won or not at the end, and based on that, you have to somehow learn a strategy. It's a hard problem, but there are many algorithms that allow you to learn very efficiently. I mean, there are a lot of material that's online if you want to learn more about reinforcement learning. And if you stick around, Chandru will tell you a little bit more. Right? But what's the real excitement about RL? Right? RL, because now reinforcement learning really works. Right? Whether it be playing video games, right, or doing very complex control problems like flying helicopters or controlling robots, or even more practical things like, pushing the right advertisement to you, or controlling power plants, or even looking at very complex domains in biology like protein folding. So people have gotten reinforcement learning systems to work really well and beat the state of the art, and many cases provide superhuman performance. Right, so people are all gone crazy. And what is it that really enabled the kind of push into reinforcement learning? Right, so that's the thing as scaling. Right, as long as I'm talking about tic-tac-toe, right? These are all the small problems, right? At most there are nine moves that I can make, and I can easily conceptualize this. What if I'm playing more complex things like a game called backgammon, or this game called Go, which has lots and lots and lots of moves. Go has like potentially 200 different things that you could do at some points in the game, right? So what happens when these things get so complicated? Or what about games like this, right? So this is still from Dota, and so you really looking at something very, very complicated. There are many different kinds of agents that are making moves and all kinds of complex things that you can do in the game, right? So how do you get your reinforcement learning agent to go from playing things like tic-tac-toe or simple problems to solving something really complex? And the answer to this lies in something called deep learning, right? So deep reinforcement learning essentially combines the power of what are called deep networks. I'm not really going to get into what deep networks are in this talk. It's not germane to us. I'm just using it to motivate the rest of the talk, right? So essentially, so if you think of tic-tac-toe, it's very easy for you to understand what is happening. You just look at the board and there are these 9 squares and pieces. You can somehow grasp it easily. But if you're looking at more complex games that we're showing you on the previous slide, you really need some way of understanding what is the situation that you find yourself in. And the deep learning agent, right, essentially gives you that. It allows you to learn features about how you're going to play the game. And then you follow that up with a control learner, which tells you, okay, what is the move that I have to make? So if I see this kind of a configuration on my screen, what should be the move that I'm going to do? Right? So that's basically what deep reinforcement learning gets us, right? And this is what has really enabled a lot of these success stories that we saw earlier, right? So scaling up, right? So earlier we thought we can solve small problems and then we can scale up, but scaling up is not an afterthought anymore, right? Because earlier you could try on small domains, but deep RL allows us to look at really large domains, right? And so we have to be more cognizant of how we do the scaling up, and we shouldn't just rely on deep reinforcement learning to get us that scale up, right? So I'll try to motivate that with some examples now. Right, so you can look at this video. This is the deep learning agent, deep reinforcement learning agent that is learning to play the game, one of the games from the Atari video game suite, right? And you can see what is happening here. There are now 25,000 frames and so on and so forth, right? So let's go a little farther ahead, right? Now you can see what's going to happen. Oh, wow, 2 million frames of training, and then finally it has learned something, right? So it's learning to play. Of course, you should know that it's a challenging task, right? Because the reinforcement learning agent doesn't know what is the ball, what is a paddle, and it doesn't know the numbers at the top or scores and so on and so forth. So it's learning a lot of things, and therefore it is taking really long to learn. But the point is, it doesn't have to, right? It doesn't really have to learn everything from scratch. It can be more clever, and so that's what we'll try to exploit later as we go along, right? So that was the game of Pong, and here's the game of Breakout, and it's starting to learn again, and it looks like it's just not doing anything. It's just beginning to learn, just like it did in Pong, right? And again, this is not something it has to do. It could potentially take some knowledge from having played Pong earlier and then do the generalization. Even though deep learning is amazing, it allows us to do this, there's a lot more work that can be done, right? So just to give you a caveat, I mean, these are old results, right? These are at least 5 years old, and there's a lot better results than this nowadays. I'm just doing this. I'm just showing you this video just to motivate why we are doing what we want to do, right? So let's move on. And you can see that this is really doing well, and you can look at that. Oh wow, 4.5 million frames, and days of training there, right? So it's not something that's going to happen that easily. Of course, now we can get it in hours, but then a lot of work went into it. Right. And let's look at another task. Okay, here's another complex game called Sequest, and the agent has to do a whole bunch of things. This is an amazing feature, right? So it has to kill some fish that is attacking it, and rescue those divers that you see, and at the same time, it should also not run out of oxygen. Right, you can see the oxygen running down here. Right? So there are multiple objectives here, but the point is there's a lot of structure to this game, right? So you have to be at the top to get oxygen, right? And then you have to shoot, and there are different kinds of behaviors that you could potentially learn, right? But unfortunately, this agent is just trying to solve it as a simple task. You can see that it's become amazingly good at killing things, right? But it doesn't even know that it needs oxygen till now, and there it dies, right? So summing up whatever I'm saying so far, right? So there are some problems with even deep reinforcement learning. Could potentially have really long training times. We have naive implementations, and it's hard to incorporate structural knowledge, right? And so hierarchical decision making is very natural to humans. We always tend to split up a problem into simpler problems and solve it, but it's very hard to get an agent to do the same, right? And and again, lack of good transfer strategies. What I mean by transfer strategies, suppose I know how to play Pong, right? I know some knowledge about how to play breakout because all it involves sliding a paddle and hitting a ball and so on and so forth, right? And that's fine. So, but even then, transfer strategies are limited to very similar tasks, right? So, if I want to do something more complex, I want to learn a set of tasks together, I still don't have a good strategy for doing that for a deep RL agent. Right? And also, we really like to learn from richer information, not just a simple reward feedback. I mean, we want to have a human give us more informed feedback so that we can learn faster and cut down on the learning time. And so I believe Professor Sriram Natarajan will talk more about that in his human allied AI talk later today. Right? And so what I'm going to do in this talk, right, I'm going to talk about taking advantage of structure so that we can learn faster. So I'm going to talk about specifically about two different pieces of work that we did. The first one is on learning hierarchical decompositions, which we call as successor options, and this appeared in the conference last year. And then I'm going to talk about how we can take a lot of these hierarchical decompositions that we have figured out from earlier problems and condense them into something simpler that you can reuse, right, in the future tasks, right, which we call as an option encoder framework, and that just recently got accepted to the European Conference on Machine Learning. Right. So before we go on, I just want to give you an idea of what I mean by this kind of structural decomposition of the problem. So let's just take a look at the screenshot, right? This is a person playing a video game. And so there are many different tasks the person has to do, and these are repeated. So you have to climb a ladder. So there are multiple places where you have to basically climb a ladder. And then you have to basically go up a rope, right? These are different kinds of behaviors. Going up a rope is one kind of behavior. Going up and down a ladder is another kind of behavior. So what you could potentially do is, instead of trying to solve this problem as just a sequence of decisions that you have to make, you can say, hey, oh, now I have to climb a ladder. Oh, now I have to get a key. Right? You can kind of decompose it into these kind of sub-problems and then try to put the solution of the sub-problems together. And here is another example where I want to know how to navigate around in this kind of house. And I can always say, oh, you want to go from room 1 to room 2. Then you basically go to the doorway and then go to the doorway of the other room from here, and then you get into room 2, as opposed to saying go step by step. You know, there's many of these problems yield to these kinds of natural decompositions, and the question is how we are going to take advantage of this, right? So what we are going to use for both the parts of the talk is something called the options framework. It's a hierarchical reinforcement learning framework where I assume that a problem is divided into subtasks, and I'm going to learn sub-policies or options that are solutions to these subtasks, right? So it could be one of the sub-policies could be climb the ladder, right? How to climb the ladder. Another one could be how to go up the rope, or another one could be just how to get out of the room, right? So I have these sub-policies, which we will call as options. And then I have like a master policy, which is like an inter-option policy that decides which option to execute at what time. And that finally decides how I interact with my world, right? And the final component of these sub-policies is, hey, when do I know that the sub-policy has ended? And there are many ways in which you can do that. And all of these three things together constitute the hierarchical RL framework, the sub-policies, the inter-option policies, and the termination functions. And so the work is successor options, which was joint work with Rahul Ramesh and Manan, who were dual degree students here at IIT Madras. And so I already motivated this part. So hierarchies help tackle the problem dimensionality. And the options framework, we already talked about that. It's like sub-policies or extended actions. And many option discovery methods typically try to find bottlenecks. Like we were talking about the doorway. They say, okay, you have to go to this bottleneck, right? But then there is another way of thinking about decomposing a problem, right? Suppose I want to give you some directions on how to get from here to the to the airport, right? So then I would not tell you, okay, look for bottlenecks, right? I'll tell you, look for landmarks. Right? So go there. Oh, just turn left and keep going until you see this big board, and then you have to make a right or something like that. So this landmark based decomposition is one other way of looking at it. Bottlenecks are useful, and landmarks are kind of a complementary approach. So basically, successor options is one way that we have for finding landmarks, right? And so what are the successor word come from? It comes from us using what is called a successor representation. So I'll just give you an intuitive idea of what a successor representation is. So you remember that we talked about representing what is going on, right? So in tic-tac-toe, you can look at the board and figure out which cells have an X and O, and that gives you information about your state, right? Or you can look at the deep network and then or look at the screen in a video game, and that gives you information about the state, right? So what we say here in successor representation is that I'm not interested in that. Suppose I want to find a representation for the red color state here, right? Then I'm going to look at what are the states that are reachable from that red color state, and that is all the information I need. I don't need an explanation of what is going on in the red color state. I really need to know where and all I can go from this red state. And that gives me a sufficient information about what I need to do at the red state. So that's basically what successor representation is. And so here is actual successor representation for this red color state. And the states that are close to this have a high value. And the states that are far away, like the cells that are far away from this red color cell, they have a low value because it's less likely that I can reach here from here. And that's basically the idea behind successor representation. And now I can convert the successor representation into an option by saying that, hey, here is my sub policy. My sub policy is climb up this mountain here, right? Climb up this mountain until you reach the peak. Right? That is my sub policy. Okay. You should realize that I'm being highly non-technical here, because in a 30-minute talk, I didn't think I would be able to give you all the background. So the sub policy is essentially a way of reaching to the peak here. And then once I reach to the peak, I say that I have reached my landmark. Okay. So that's basically how I'm going to convert these successor representations into options. Okay. But then there are every possible cell here could have a successor representation, right? So which of these cells would I choose? So what we do is, so we take the world, right? And then we build successor representations for every cell in this grid world. And then we cluster them together. We look at things that look similar. Okay, which of these pictures look similar? So all of them go into one cell. And then for every such cluster or grouping of cells I have, I'll pick one of them to be my landmark. Right? So like that, for every group I have, I'll have one cell that is my landmark. And then I learn a policy, sub policy to go to that cell. And then I use that to solve the problem. Right? And so that's essentially what successor options does. So it's a simple idea. So we could do this with more and more complex problems, not just the simple one that we looked at. And so the nice thing about using this kind of clustering-based approach is that our landmarks tend to be very well separated. And there are other kinds of approaches that do this, which don't do a great job. For example, there's a paper called Eigenoptions, which is very powerful and is one of the best papers out there. But you really need to look at like hundreds of options, hundreds of landmarks before you get a useful set of landmarks. While with SR options, you get some things with very little. Right? So I'll skip this in the interest of time. So these are, and they'll show you some of the results. Right? You can see here there are 4 different successor options that we discovered, and they are all executing. You can see that they are all moving in different ways, even though they are all walking through the same world. Right? And here you can see this arm that is trying to reach out. So it's basically showing you the 4 different sub landmarks that it learned. It's learning to go to the 4 different corners of the table. Right? It does that automatically. We never tell it what to go to this corner or that corner. It just basically waves around randomly for a while and then figures out which is the direction it has to go. So it figures out, okay, these 4 things seem to be a nice landmark to learn. Okay, so that's basically what we did with successor options. And so there are a whole bunch of directions to go in the future. And so let me quickly try and get to option encoder. And this is joint work with Arjun Manoharan, who is a master's by research student here, and Rahul Ramesh, who was part of the earlier work as well. And so some approaches allow us to learn options, right, just by interacting with the world, no prior knowledge needed. But in some cases, they can learn many options. In some cases, hundreds of options, only some are useful. So we start out to ask the question, can we take these many options and kind of distill them into a much smaller set that is almost as useful as the larger set, right? So we want these reduced set of options to be task agnostic. We don't want it to be useful for just doing only one specific task. And we also want it to capture the different kinds of behavior that the original set of options were actually modeling, right? And so we take advantage of all the recent advances in deep learning and deep RL. And so basically what we do here is that we reduce the number of options. So here we start off with 4 options and we bring it down to 2. And the way we do it is such that if I'm able to recover the original option behavior from these 2 options, how well am I able to recover the original option behavior from these 2 options, right? And whether I can stitch these options together and solve new tasks. Right? These are basically these are the 2 things that I'm looking for when I try to reduce the set of options. Okay? First, can I recover the original behaviors of the larger set of options? And second, how well can I solve tasks by using this? This allows us to pick the number of smaller options, the number of options that I need to learn. Right. So again, I'm not getting into the details of it. So here is an example of what we did. So we started off with 16 different options, and they are all taking you to different parts in these simple 4-room example that we saw earlier as well. Now I distilled into 4 policies, and you can see that the first policy takes me into room 1, the second policy takes me to room 2, the third policy takes me to room 3, and fourth one takes me to another one. Right, so it's very nice behavior, right? So instead of looking at 16, which had 4 different things, I managed to group them nicely into 4 different policies. And I do this just by looking at the behavior of the options. And this allows us to do more complex things later. This is just an illustration, right? And what you see in the middle is one of the state-of-the-art methods for distilling policies. But it typically gives you only one policy. And that one policy gives me, basically takes me to the top left room alone and doesn't have a good coverage as this. And so we ran it on a much more complex world. So we selected, so we learned 50 options, and then we have 100 randomly selected goals. And then we needed to see if we can reach these 100 goals by learning. And you can see that the green curve is what we have, right? So that is our approach with the distilled policies. And you can see that it's much faster. So the lower the curve is here, the better the performance is. And you can see that it is learning much faster than the other methods and across the various grid worlds that you see. And the more complex the grid world becomes, and the greater the advantage that you see here, right? And we did a very various number of ablation studies, yeah. So we again, I'm not going to get into the details of it. I just keep checking the time. But here is one thing that I wanted to tell, right? Suppose I'm distilling my 50 policies into 5 policies. That's basically what we have been doing so far, right? I take 50 policies that I have learned earlier for different landmarks, and I bring it down to 5 policies that are distilled, right? What if I just choose randomly some 5 policies? Is it because I reduced my number from 50 different things I can do to 5 different things? Is it learning faster? Or is this 5 that I'm learning through my process is something important, right? And it turns out that the random sampling is really not that great. You can see that they're all over the place, but this red line, which is essentially the distilled policy, again, you can see that it learns faster, it has a lower variability. So it's certainly a much more useful set of 5 policies than picking policies at random or picking experts at random out of the original set of experts. Right, and we did more complex experiments. In fact, this is an interesting one, the DeepMind lab, because as you saw earlier, it basically gives you the camera view, right? It's like the front view of what you're going to see. It doesn't give you this kind of top-down view. So you have to make out where you are from the front view alone. So basically, we had 4 policies that will take me to the 4 different corners of this room. Right, so I start from here and go to one of these 4 corners, and then we distill down to 2 policies. And it turns out that the 2 policies, one basically goes to the top left and bottom left, and the other one goes to the top right and bottom right. And you can see the videos here, right? So basically, the distill policy 2 goes to the top right or bottom right, and the distill policy 1 goes to the top left or bottom left of this rooms. And this is the thing that it's saying, and it doesn't get a top down. So we're getting meaningful policies, and how useful are this in solving the problems? We saw it already earlier. And here is another more complex maze task. And again, when we use this actor mimic network, we don't get a good we don't get a good coverage across all the 16, all the 24 goals that we wanted to reach. But when we distill, we get a much better coverage. I mean, there are some cases which are a little harder. But most of these behaviors we are able to capture. We are able to go to all the different 24 goals that we wanted to. Right. Again, we did this with the fetch reach task. So as you remember that it's trying to navigate in this workspace, and it is trying to reach to that red ball. So these are the orange dots here are the various locations that I would like it to reach to. These are the landmarks that I wanted to achieve. And we can see that when I distill it into 2 policies, right, from these many different policies, and it is distilled to 2 policies. There is one that goes to the left side of the workspace, and there's one that goes to the right side. It roughly captures the behavioral spread. But if I distill it to a single policy, then it basically goes to the middle, right? So not able to generalize well. And again, if I do 4 policies, it does this. So top to the left, bottom to the left, top to the right, bottom to the right. And then when I do 6 policies, again, it captures some kind of a difference in behavior, and I can do more policies and it happens, right? So we essentially, in this work, we demonstrated the feasibility of doing this. But what is more interesting for me, this is actually gives us a way to do a lifelong learning. You know, an agent can continue learning newer and newer problems, and at periodic intervals can just compress whatever it has learned, so that it learns this distribution of behaviors, doesn't have to go further, right? So I'm just concluding very quickly here. So reinforcement learning has really revived the excitement in the community. You can see that the papers that are growing up exponentially. But let's take a look at this video, right? So that's a humanoid learning to play football. It's doing great, right? It's running around and learning to kick the ball into the goal and all that. But then that's because the goalie is actually trying to stop it from scoring goals, and that is how it was trained. Now let's look at a different goalie. Okay, that goalie just lying down on the ground and crying, and the guy who's trying to score the goal, who was playing so well before, is completely confused and is just going off the rocker, right? It's just not even approaching the ball. Oh my God, he looks drunk, right? So reinforcement learning is really revived the excitement, a lot of success stories, but many fundamental questions still need to be addressed in RL. So we have a long way to go. And for me, the goal for RL should be omnivorous learning. We should be able to consume any information. So we should not be just reliant on learning from this reward signal, falling down hurts kind of a thing, but we should be able to watch other human cycle and should learn something from it, right? So we want to push artificial agents closer to how humans learn. And there's a lot of work that is done in our group looking at various aspects of it. I just presented a sampler for you today. And I also want to acknowledge all the students who worked on it. You can see that my picture is much smaller than them because their contribution to all of this work is much, much larger than mine. So Rahul, who was a dual degree student here, is now pursuing a PhD at UPenn. And Manan Tomar was again a dual degree student here. Now he's with Facebook AI Research. And Arjun Manoharan, who is a master's by research student, and who should be joining Verisk very shortly, Verisk Analytics very shortly. And again, so thank you for listening. I'll take some questions now. And if you want more information about any of this work, I mean, there are links available on the homepage of RBC site. Right. Okay, so I can take questions. Arun, can you help me with picking out some interesting questions? There are just too many.
Okay, so here is one. What are the limitations of RL?
I showed you one. that RL, people have not really looked at adversarial robustness of reinforcement learning yet, and there are other issues in terms of when you're looking really at safety critical applications and trying to get reinforcement learning to work with those in the live system is still a challenge. So people typically look at some kind of simulations that you've built and then learn with those. In the absence of simulations, it's still a challenge. There's a lot of work done again in that space, but it's still a challenge. So I would say these are the two main limitations of RL right now.
Okay, so maybe one more question. So is RL fundamentally a combinatorial problem?
Depends on how you look at it. I mean, in a very discrete space, it looks like a combinatorial problem, but reinforcement learning also can work in continuous spaces, right? In fact, reinforcement learning can be viewed as one way of doing optimal control, right? So where you're looking at a continuous domain. So at that point, I think talking about combinatorial explosion is moot, right? But when you're talking about discrete spaces, RL is essentially solving some kind of planning problem, and so it's going to at the heart of it there is a combinatorial issue there. That's essentially what people call the curse of dimensionality also in discrete spaces. Okay, I think we are out of time. In the interest of keeping everything on time, I mean, I shouldn't delay the proceedings. So I'm going to stop sharing and yield the stage to the next speaker.
Thanks, Ravi, for the wonderful talk.